History is often written in the grand, brutal strokes of battles won and lost. We speak of divisions, of industrial might, of the cold calculus of war. But sometimes, the most profound conflicts are not fought on the battlefield. They are fought in the mind. In the final, desperate years of the Second World War, a strange and forgotten chapter of the conflict unfolded not in the rubble of Europe, but under the vast open skies of Texas. Here, thousands of German prisoners of war were held in camps scattered across the state. Among them, a unique and often overlooked group: women. These were not all soldiers. Many were civilians, wives of German scientists and diplomats, swept up in the tides of war and interned for the duration. They arrived with minds saturated by years of relentless propaganda. They expected to meet a nation of degenerate, bloodthirsty barbarians, the Untermenschen of Goebbels' terrifying caricatures. They were prepared for chains, for brutality, for the callous disregard they had been told was the American way. What they were not prepared for were cowboys. They were not prepared for an encounter that would so utterly dismantle their entire worldview, not with force, but with a quiet, baffling act of cultural kindness. This is not a story about the triumph of arms. It is the story of a clash between ideology and reality, a psychological war won not with bullets, but with something far more potent, a simple, human gesture. How did a ride on a horse become a more effective tool of denazification than any lecture or pamphlet? This is the intellectual puzzle we are here to solve. To understand the profound shock these women experienced, we must first inhabit their minds. We must understand the world as they saw it, a world constructed and reinforced by one of the most sophisticated propaganda machines in human history. The central conflict of this story is a collision between two diametrically opposed philosophies. On one side, we have the fortress of the mind, the meticulously constructed ideological prison of National Socialism. This was a worldview built on paranoia, on the necessity of a perpetual enemy, and on a rigid, hierarchical understanding of human value. The Nazi propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels did not simply lie. It crafted an entire reality. It depicted the United States not as a rival power, but as a culturally bankrupt, racially polluted wasteland. Americans, they were told, were a mongrel race, a chaotic mix of Negroes, Jews, and gangsters, incapable of true culture or martial spirit. The American man was portrayed as either a thuggish gangster or a soft, decadent weakling. There was no room for nuance in this fortress. It was a closed system designed to repel any contradictory information. On the other side of this conflict, we have the open range. This represents not an ideology, but a reality, the sprawling, unpredictable, and culturally unique landscape of wartime Texas. It symbolizes an openness, a pragmatism, and an informal code of conduct that simply did not compute within the rigid framework of the Nazi mind. The Texas cowboy, a figure of American myth, became the unwitting ambassador of this reality. He was not a soldier following orders from a central command, but an individual guided by a different set of principles, a frontier ethic of self-reliance, neighborly respect, and a deep, almost spiritual connection to the land and his animals. This is the battleground, the fortified, paranoid mind of the believer against the disarming, unscripted reality of the open range. Our story centers primarily on a unique facility in South Texas, the Crystal City Family Camp. This was not a typical POW camp filled with hardened soldiers. It was an internment camp for civilians of German, Japanese, and Italian descent, including many women and children. Some were German nationals who had been living in the United States or Latin America and were arrested as potential security risks. Others were the wives and families of diplomats and specialists. Let us imagine ourselves as one of these women. Perhaps her name is Ilse. She is the wife of a German engineer who was working in America. Since 1933, she has been fed a steady diet of the Reich's official truth. She has seen the newsreels of Germany's glorious victories. She has been told that the world outside the Reich is a place of chaos and decay, held in the grip of a Jewish conspiracy. Now she finds herself a prisoner. The journey to Texas has been one of fear and humiliation. The train journey across the vast, empty American landscape would have been disorienting, a world away from the manicured forests and ancient villages of Germany. She arrives at Crystal City, a place with fences and guard towers, confirming her worst fears. She is an enemy in an enemy land. But then the dissonance begins. The camp, while a prison, is not the death camp her own government was building across Europe. There are schools for the children. Families are allowed to live together. The food, while simple, is adequate. The American guards are not the snarling brutes of the propaganda posters. They're often bored young men, professional, and largely indifferent. This initial cognitive dissonance is the first crack in the fortress. The most profound psychological disruption, however, would come from outside the camp's fences. Because of its location in rural South Texas, the Crystal City camp was surrounded by ranch land. The local population was not a faceless industrial workforce. It was a community of farmers and cowboys, men whose lives were dictated by the seasons and the needs of their livestock. Now, we must be precise. There is no single official document titled Operation Cowboy Kindness. These encounters were not part of a government-run psychological warfare program. They were organic, spontaneous interactions that grew out of a unique set of circumstances. On occasion, small, supervised groups of internees were permitted to leave the camp for work details on the surrounding farms and ranches, particularly during labor shortages. It was here that Ilse and the other German women first came face to face with the American male in his natural habitat, not as a soldier, but as a Texan. Imagine the scene. A group of German women, taught to believe they are in the presence of subhuman gangsters, are assigned to help with the harvest or some other form of light farm labor. The men overseeing them are not uniformed guards barking orders. They are weathered men in dusty boots and cowboy hats. Their language is slow, their manners direct but not unkind. They are focused on the work at hand. But then, at the end of a long, hot day, one of the cowboys notices the women's exhaustion and their fascination with the horses. In the German imagination, a horse is a noble creature, a symbol of cavalry, of aristocracy, of a heroic bygone era. And then the moment of rupture occurs. A cowboy, instead of leading the women back to a truck in sullen silence, might motion towards one of his horses. There is no order, no threat. It's a simple, unspoken gesture. Perhaps through a translator or with broken English and hand signals, he offers them a ride. One can almost hear the gears of the indoctrinated mind grinding to a halt. The propaganda had a clear script for brutality. Chains, beatings, degradation, these were the expected actions of the barbaric American. But what is the correct ideological response to a simple act of kindness? How do you reconcile the image of a bloodthirsty degenerate with the reality of a man who trusts you enough to put you on his most prized possession, his horse? He doesn't put them in chains, he puts them on a saddle. The act is so profoundly at odds with the expected reality that the mind cannot easily dismiss it. It's not an argument, it's an experience. The sun is setting over the vast Texas plains. The smell of leather and dust is in the air, and for a few moments, Ilse is not a prisoner. She is just a person, on a horse, being treated like a person by another. This was not a singular event.
Accounts from various POW and internment camps in the rural South and Midwest echo this theme. The personal, informal, and often compassionate interactions with ordinary Americans had a far greater impact on the prisoners' psyches than any formal re-education effort. To fully grasp the psychological magnitude of this moment, we must contrast it with the alternative, the reality these women had been spared. On the Eastern Front, the war was being fought exactly as the propaganda had described, a war of racial annihilation. When the Red Army captured German soldiers or civilians, there was no ambiguity. The conflict was ideological, brutal, and existential. The hatred was real, forged in years of unimaginable suffering inflicted by the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. A German woman captured in the East could expect nothing but the harshest of treatment. This is the reality that the Nazi worldview was built to explain. The Judeo-Bolshevik subhuman was real in the minds of the German soldiers, and they fought him with a savagery they believed was necessary for survival. The German women in Texas were mentally prepared for the Eastern Front. They were psychologically braced for a war of extermination because their leaders had told them all their enemies were the same. The cowboy, in his quiet kindness, did something far more devastating than a Soviet commissar ever could. He refused to play his assigned role in their paranoid drama. He revealed, in a single gesture, that the entire script was a lie. This wasn't just a contradiction. It was a betrayal by their own leaders who had so profoundly misrepresented the world. The psychological climax is not a single dramatic event, but a slow dawning realization. It's the moment the fortress of the mind crumbles, not from a frontal assault, but from within. The ride on the horse is the catalyst, but it is reinforced by countless other small incongruities. It's the guard who shares a piece of chewing gum with a child. It's the local townspeople who don't spit at them, but largely ignore them. It's the sheer, undeniable normality and decency of the very people they had been taught to despise. The mind, when faced with such a profound contradiction between belief and experience, has only two options: reject the experience or reject the belief. To reject the experience, to say, that cowboy was tricking me, it was a form of psychological torture, becomes increasingly difficult with each repeated act of simple humanity. Therefore, the only other option is to question the belief. If Goebbels was wrong about the Americans, could he have been wrong about other things? If the degenerate cowboy is in fact a decent and hard-working man, what does that say about the master race? This is the true moment of denazification. It is not the acceptance of American propaganda over German propaganda. It is the collapse of the very idea of a world that can be neatly divided into heroes and monsters. It is the shattering of the ideological mirror that has reflected a distorted, hateful image of the world. What is left is a confusing, complex, and deeply human reality. For a true believer, this moment is terrifying. It is a fall from certainty into a sea of doubt. After the war, when these women were repatriated to a devastated and divided Germany, they carried this experience with them. They were among the first to have seen, with their own eyes, that the foundation of the Third Reich was built on a lie. The long-term impact of America's generally humane treatment of its millions of German POWs is a vastly underrated element of the post-war reconciliation. While the Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany's economy, experiences like these, repeated in countless camps across the country, helped to rebuild a psychological bridge. These former prisoners became an informal network of ambassadors for a different idea of America, one that stood in stark contrast to both Nazi and later Soviet propaganda. The big idea that this story teaches us is profound. It is that ideology is, at its core, a fragile construct. It can withstand arguments, it can deflect evidence, and it can survive frontal attacks. but it often cannot survive a simple, sustained, and authentic encounter with human decency. The most effective psychological warfare may not be warfare at all. The most powerful tool for changing a mind is not a more clever piece of propaganda, but an undeniable act of humanity that forces the other person to see you not as a category, but as a person. The Cowboys of Texas didn't set out to win a psychological war. They didn't have a doctrine or a manual. They just acted like themselves. And in doing so, they achieved what entire armies and propaganda ministries could not. They opened a crack in the fortress of a closed mind. War is a story of systems, of logistics, of ideologies clashing with terrible force. We measure it in bombs dropped and territory gained. But the human mind is the ultimate territory. And in the strange, forgotten chapter of the war in Texas, we learn a timeless lesson. We learn that a worldview built on hatred and fear, no matter how meticulously constructed, can be dismantled. Sometimes, all it takes is a vast open sky, a quiet act of trust, and the shocking, disarming kindness of putting an enemy on a horse instead of in chains. It proves that the most powerful weapon against a dehumanizing ideology is, and always will be, a simple, stubbornly human gesture.